Hello, everybody. My name is Christian Mauder. I'm Associate Professor in the Study of Religions at the University of Bergen. I welcome you to this video interview on the use and usefulness of the concepts of canonization and codification in Islamic studies. The interview is part of a series of kickoff events of the CanCode project based at the University of Bergen. For more information about the project, check out our website uib.no/CanCode. My guest today is Jonathan Brown. Professor Brown is the Al-Walid bin Talal Chair of Islamic Civilization in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Thank you very much for being with us today, Professor Brown.
My pleasure.
Your monograph, The Canonization of al-Bukhari and Muslim, published with Brill in 2007, has been of central importance in putting the concept of canonization on the agenda of Islamic studies, and is one of our central theoretical reference texts in the CanCode project. Could you tell us a bit about how you came to use the concept of canonization in your work?
I'm actually really surprised that I didn't know anyone actually read this book, and I'm actually very happy to hear that somebody's using it for something. I wrote it, God knows how many years ago, 13, 14 years ago or something. So going back and rereading it for this interview was an interesting experience. So I mean, for me, it was, I think it was kind of natural, inevitable in a way. When people talked about these mainstay Hadith collections in Sunni Islam or in Islam in general, right? They would talk about Hadith canon. I think, the way that we would talk about sort of like, a canon of, the best action movies, or a canon of the best, European literature. We would just, we use the term in our casual and also in our kind of academic language to talk about a set of representative or authoritative texts in a tradition. So in a lot of ways, it was just a product of how people in general, generations of Western scholars of Islam had talked about these books. And then at the time I was a PhD student at University of Chicago. There was an Israeli professor named Menachem Brinker, who is a literature professor, modern Hebrew literature, who happened to be teaching a class on canons and canonization. And I took the class, and it was kind of really eye-opening for me. I would never have been able to do this had it not been, for sort of his guidance and giving me a window into the way people talk about literary canons and the kind of writing about canon, sort of the Bible as scripture and literature. So that was how I came into it, and I think it was useful.
I see. Thank you very much. Since the publication of the canonization of al-Bukhari and Muslim, you have also engaged with other processes of canonization in Islamic history. For example, in your writings about the Shi'i Hadith canon and about the canonization of Ibn Majah's Sunan. There, you have highlighted the role of utility in the formation of Hadith canons. How have these and other studies contributed to the development of your thought about canonization compared to what you have written in your first book?
Well, I think one of the questions one often has is to what extent are you imposing a theoretical framework on a subject matter that might not, where that might not be natural, right? So, some people would say that, canon is a Western concept or a European concept. And so, you're imposing it on Islamic tradition. And I think when you read, when you realize that, canons sort of are talked about in the law, they're talked about in literature, they're talked about in scripture in the Western tradition. And there's so many different ways you can think about it. And there's so many ways that it has been thought about, that it's it's more of a flexible tool that you can use in your study. And it should always be what you're studying that governs the way you approach it, right? So you always look at something in its own right, but thinking about canons is a way that I think it gives you sort of three advantages. One is you realize that there's certain common processes, right? So let's say between Judaism, the Jewish Orthodox tradition, and Islamic tradition, you realize that there's certain common processes, like Moshe Hablatal in his excellent book, People of the Book. He talks about text-centered communities. he talks about something called the principle of charity, which means that once a book becomes authorized and canonized, it sort of has to be read in a way that makes it true, right? And so you have to kind of elide or interpret away internal contradictions or contradictions with other sources of truth. You see, this is exactly the same thing you find in the Islamic tradition. Another thing is that it brings into relief things that you might not have noticed otherwise. So, James Sanders talks about this idea of intense canonical process, a period of intense canonical process, when a community is sort of like digesting a material and is sort of getting ready to be in the mindset of authorizing it and kind of selecting texts. And then you can see, oh, wow, this is happening in, let's say, the 1000s or the 900s in the Islamic tradition. And finally, you can take tools and repurpose them entirely for new uses, right? So I remember reading like Hayden White's work on history as literature, and he talks about synecdoche. And synecdoche is when the 50 hands, all hands on deck, right? So the hand is representing the whole sailor, right? So the hand is synecdoche for the whole person. And so then this has nothing to do with the Hadith canon or anything, but I started thinking about the notion of the Hadith canon as a synecdoche of the prophet's persona, or of the prophet's sunnah, or his precedent, or the prophet person himself. And so you can, just because you come across a tool in one tradition, you might end up seeing a use for that in a totally different way in what you're studying. So what I noticed is the common themes of discussions about canon is you're talking about texts, you're talking about authority, you're talking about community. And at the canons kind of exist at the intersection of these three things, but how they interact, why they interact, what you want to do with it is really up to the scholar. So in the case of utility, I guess I really went back to this idea that you see repeatedly in studies of literature and biblical canons, which is that canons meet needs of a community. So communities canonize texts because they have certain needs, right? The communities need these texts to do things for them. So looking at, let's say, the Sunnah of Ibn Majah, whereas in the case of, let's say, Bukhari and Muslim's Sahihain, the need was for standards of authenticity, standards of excellence, agreed upon bodies of text that everybody agreed upon as authentic. The case of Ibn Majah, his Sunan is actually full of weak hadiths, unreliable hadiths, but it was really useful for Sunni Muslims because it extended the body of texts that they could use as proof texts in their discussions with one another. And even more importantly is, let's say you have a hadith in Bukhari's book that has like A, B, and in Muslim's book it has B, C, and D. And another book it has, C, D, and E or something, right? Ibn Majah will have a hadith that in and of itself is actually unreliable, but it has A, B, C, D, and E all in one package. So whereas you'd have to cite a couple of different hadiths to get a point across, citing his book, Ibn Majah's book, allows you to do it with just one hadith. That material is all kind of verified and authenticated in other books, but his book gives it to you in this kind of, although it's in and of itself unreliable, a succinct package. So I realized that this was like the utility of this book is it was very convenient for Sunni scholars to cite.
I see. Thank you very much. My next question addresses something that you've already touched upon, namely that, like many other concepts in the academic study of Islam, canonization is not an emic concept developed within Islamic societies. Rather, its origins go back to pre-Islamic Europe, and it has been widely employed in the study of Judaism and Islam before it has been used in Islamic studies. In what ways should scholars take this history of the concept into account when they apply to Islamic intellectual history?
I don't know. I mean, I don't think so. I don't think they need to. I think that, like I said, these concepts are really broad, right? I mean, they're extremely internally diverse. I mean, even if they come from the Western tradition, they are so contested internally. There's so much kind of thought produced about them and within them that you really, I always think about it as like a Mr. Potato Head. I don't know if you have these in Europe, you know, this Mr. Potato Head toy where, well, when I was a kid, you had these things. It was this plastic potato, and it would have these like pieces that, like, you know, a head and a nose and an ear and an eye, and you could pick different noses and ears and eyes and put it on your Mr. Potato Head. It was called Mr. Potato Head and his bucket of parts. And so I think a lot of these things are kind of like Mr. Potato Heads, where you can kind of draw on, you can use them as you see fit. And so I think that it's really what I really valued, and I think at almost every project I've done since then, I kind of do the same thing, which is, you know, you're reading the, let's say, like Islamic sources that you're basing your study on, or whatever tradition you're looking at. But then, you know, in a parallel process, you're kind of reading about subjects or theories or comparative areas that might be useful. Just you have a sense that maybe this is a common process. Maybe there's something going on here that's similar. And then, you know, I think the mistake is when you allow these like outside traditions to dictate strictly how you approach the Islamic tradition. But I think to the extent that they help you, one, notice comparative common processes, to the extent that they bring into relief things that you otherwise wouldn't notice. And then also, as the third thing I mentioned, they give you tools that you might take and put in an entirely different part of your Mr. Potato Head, but it might end up being really useful as a tool for you. And it actually, then you become a kind of a theoretical creator, right? You become somebody who's contributing even a theoretical tool in a new way.
I see, thank you. In your most recent monograph, Slavery and Islam, published with One World in 2020, you engaged in detail with the Islamic legal tradition, which also stands at the center of what we are doing in the CanCode project. Do you have thoughts on how the concept of canonization can be used in Islamic legal studies, and how it might be used differently there than in Hadith studies?
Yeah, well, there's one of the books that I remember reading. I mean, there's a couple of books that had already applied the idea of the canon to Islamic tradition. One of them was Brandon Wheeler's book. I think it's called Applying the Canon in Islam, about Hanafi law. And then Ahmed al-Shamsi's book, The Canonization of Islamic Law, about Imam al-Shafi'i. And I think if I'm not mistaken, both books, they kind of draw on the work of Jonathan Z. Smith and Jan Assmann, this idea of canon as a way of both delimiting text. So you narrow down what are the sources or the types of sources or the genre of material that can be drawn on as authoritative in a tradition. But then once you've done that, you simultaneously empower it and authorize it to be mined for interpretive material later on, right? So you both delimit something into a representative set of texts or a set of material, but then in that act of kind of making that important and special, you, as Frank Kermode says, you stamp it like license for exegesis. This now becomes something that can be looked back on and reinterpreted and reimagined to extend that authority to new situations or outward. So I think Brandon Wheeler does this with the early Hanafi canon of texts, of legal texts, literally books of law. And I think Ahmed al-Shamsi's, you probably have these guys talking in the series as well, so I don't want to misrepresent their work, but you know that for Imam al-Shafi'i, it was really about that he kind of authorized a certain way of talking about the law and a certain way of making arguments for the authority of a legal ruling, right? How do you derive legal rulings? And then other schools of law kind of had to adopt this and use that language in justifying their own bodies of law. So I think it was in certainly the case of Ahmed al-Shamsi's work, it was much less about canon as a set of texts and more as canon as a kind of authorized process or an authorized way of talking about the law.
I see. In your book, Misquoting Muhammad, you repeatedly use the term codification, which is another term that is very interesting for our purposes to refer to developments in Islamic legal history. However, you do not apply the concept of codification to the Hadith canon. How do you use the concept of codification in your work? And do you think it is applicable at all to the Hadith canon?
Well, you know, it's kind of interesting because the word Canon in Greek, right, is where we get the word canon, standard of measurement, is actually also adopted by Muslims in Arabic with the word qanun, which is, in the medieval Islamic world, it kind of means like a measure, a kind of authoritative work or a standard. But then the actual word for canonization in Arabic would be taqneen, which is used to mean codification in law, right? So the irony is that the word canonization in Arabic from the Greek word literally means in modern, the sort of 19th and 20th century means codification of law. The other irony is that I remember when I first started doing research on this in the Islamic tradition and canonization, is that, people would say, you can't really talk about canonization in Islam because in Islam, there's no church councils that are creating these canons. But of course, the fact is that the biblical canon is not created by a church council, right? There's no church council that creates these until the Council of Trent in like 1546, right? But I mean, the emergence of the biblical canon, the Old Testament, the New Testament canons are done sort of ground up through peer recognition of scholars and, books that are agreed upon as used almost like by the community of scholars. And so in the end, actually, the Islamic tradition is the same way. In reality, I think most canons are not actually authorized top down. They grow from the bottom up. But the reason I think that codification is not really applicable in the concept of, I don't think it actually overlaps a lot with canonization, is precisely because codification is by definition the act of the state, right? So we talk about codification of law and legal codes. We're talking about something that starts happening a little bit in Germany in the 1700s, a lot in Europe in the early 1800s and the mid 1800s, and of course also in the United States in that time, and then also in the Ottoman Empire at the same time, right? Where it's the state. Codification is an act of the modern administrative states, the pervasive, all-encompassing, dominating modern states, right? Which is taking a legal tradition and really reformatting it to be allegedly transparent, allegedly rational, allegedly consistent, allegedly universal, allegedly applicable by kind of relatively untrained judges, sort of standardization, routinization, transparency, technicalization, right? So in the codification is maybe the quintessential act of the modern all-powerful state, which is sort of the exact opposite of how canons emerge in literature and scripture and even the law in the pre-modern world. So I think that ironically, codification is sort of in both cases, you're talking about authorizing a text for a community, but it's in some ways you might even think about it as like the kind of evil twin. If canonization is like the hero, the codification is like the guy with a goatee and a scar who looks just like the hero, but is the evil, or at least the government's version.
I see. Thank you very much, Professor Brown, for being with us today and for sharing your thoughts on canonization and codification with us. Thank you.
My pleasure.